The biggest news today is going to come from the results of the Turkish presidential election, of which is currently underway in Turkey, the second round of which is currently underway in Turkey. Since, as of the time of making of this video, I don't have the results. You probably will have them by the time you are watching this video. Well, as I don't have them at the moment, I'm going to defer discussion of the results of that election until my next video. All I would say is that it would be a very considerable electoral upset indeed by this point if President Erdogan failed to win. This despite the fact that I get the sense that the stops have been pulled out by some people to prevent him doing so. And it may not be a coincidence that the Turkish currency, the lira, has come under very significant pressure over the last few weeks since the first round, though one has to also say that some of President Erdogan's economic policies, notably his unwillingness to raise interest rates, might also have played a role. Anyway, to repeat again, I'm not going to get into a deep discussion about the Turkish election in this program because without results, I can't see that doing so would serve any useful purpose. I am going to touch later on this program on the debt ceiling affair in the United States. I've not covered it to any great extent in this program, because to be blunt, I consider it an artificial crisis, which really, in all truth, isn't any sort of crisis at all. I will explain why later in this program. There are other things going on in the world. Notably, there's been some kind of a border clash between Afghanistan and Iran. This has happened before when the Taliban government was previously in power. I recall that there were border clashes between Afghanistan and Iran, and indeed at one point Iran mobilized very large forces, this was back in the 1990s, in preparation for what some thought might have been a major military operation against the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Taliban, as I recall, on that occasion backed down. The exact causes of this latest clash are unknown to me. I doubt that they have any major geopolitical significance. The relationship between the Taliban and the Iranian government has always been prickly, and it's perhaps unsurprising given the fact that the Taliban has only weak control, I suspect, over some of its militias. The clashes of this kind take place from time to time. I would say, however, that contrary to many expectations, there's been a significant stabilization of the situation in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over. The number of violent deaths appears to have declined significantly. The worst economic crisis, the worst expectations of an economic crisis, including a collapse into famine, were not fulfilled. I suspect largely because Afghanistan got a great deal of help from the big Eurasian powers, China and Russia, which appear to be in constant dialogue with the Taliban government, though, once again, we don't have a huge amount of information about this. However, I mention all of these facts, all of these events, just to illustrate the fact that though Ukraine dominates these programs, it is not just the conflict in Ukraine which is taking place. In fact, across the global south, there is a great deal of criticism of the West's fixation on the crisis in Ukraine and its insistence on trying to shape the entire international environment around that crisis, neglecting the concerns and problems of the global south and indeed the rest of the world. Now, having said that, I'm going to indulge in the same practice that so many people in the Global South criticise. I am going to focus this programme again on the situation in Ukraine and around it, because first of all, I think it is exceptionally dangerous, as we shall see, but also because whether I like it or not, the Western powers have made it the primary focus of their fixation, and I live in the West, and I am therefore greatly affected by it. So, with apologies to those who live outside the West, I will now turn once more to that perennial subject of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine. Well, first of all, what has been going on the battlefronts? Well, we've not actually had a huge amount of news. It seems that the Russians continue to enlarge their bridgehead across the Oskol River in the northern parts of the battlefront. They also claim to have repelled a Ukrainian attack in the southern town of Vuhledar, and indeed to have disrupted an attempt by Ukraine to rotate its forces there. There have been more pictures, more film of heavy shelling around Marinka, near Donetsk city. A little further north of Marinka, where, by the way, my view is that the Russians, just to quickly add in parentheses, if you like, I think that Russian policy in Marinka has been the same as it was during the Battle of Bakhmut, to allow the Ukrainians to occupy undefendable positions, causing the Ukrainians to constantly reinforce those positions and giving the Russians more opportunities to carry out heavy attrition of those Ukrainian forces. I'm confident that if the Russians were really focused on capturing Marinka, clearing the last remnants of Ukrainian control in Marinka, they would have done it a long time ago. And by the way, just to add to that, I feel that if Ukraine, for its part, were rationally led in this war, it too would have pulled its forces out of Marinka long ago. But anyway, just to continue this broad brush summary of events, there's continuing Russian pressure on Avdiivka. I've even seen a report which suggests that the Russians actually, having captured a place called Kaminka, I'm not quite sure where this is, but it is connected to the fighting in Avdiivka, that the Russians are actually reached Avdiivka itself and might even control some sections of some northern sections of this relatively small town. I can't confirm that, and I'm not sure that this is the case, and it could be that I'm misreading some of these reports. Well, round the town that the world has come to call the Bakhmut, but which the Russians call Artyomovsk, and which, consistent with my practice of referring to towns by the name of those who control, by the name given to them by those who control them, I will now start to refer to it as Artyomovsk. Well, close to Artyomovsk, there has been fighting. Now, yesterday, I said that the Russians had made advances in the northern sections around the Berehova reservoir, and that is essentially confirmed. They've recovered a lot of the ground that they had lost during the Ukrainian flanking attacks of a few weeks ago. However, there were reports yesterday of perhaps rather bigger movements. There were claims that the Russian forces had launched a frontal assault on Ivanivska, the place they called Krasnoye, and are making a serious effort to capture Ivanivska. It was a solitary report I saw. I don't know whether it's correct or not. There we go. It might be happening, it might not be happening. I've not seen much corroboration of this, but certainly there do seem to be fighting of some kind taking place in Ivanivska. I do get the sense that it is the Russians who are pushing forward there, but I can't say exactly what is going on in and around Ivanivska and whether there really is a Russian attempt to capture Ivanivska. Further north, in the area of Orekhovo-Vasilievka, according to Boris Rozhin, there was a significant Ukrainian attack, but Boris Rozhin, the Russian commentator who writes under the pen name Colonel Kassad, according to Boris Rozhin, this attack was repelled, again with heavy losses. And he's even suggested that Operation Bakhmut Meat Grinder continues, in the sense that Ukraine still suffers losses as a result of these flank attacks, and that this is exactly what the Russians want to see happen. Well, again, this largely comes from Boris Rozhin, who is, it must be said, one of the most reliable commentators about events on the battlefields that I know, and one who consistently leans to the side of caution. So I suspect that he's reporting things accurately, but again, I'm not going to pretend that I have much information about what exactly is taking place. Now, I've also received reports that as the Wagner forces pull out of Artyomovsk, they are being replaced, obviously, by regular army troops, troops of the regular Russian army, but increasing numbers of Chechen volunteer troops. Now, the Chechen forces are an interesting force, because though it's tempting to refer to them as militia, they're actually, so far as I can see, highly trained fighters, very well organized, and they have been operating as part of the Russian armed forces for a very considerable length of time. In Syria, by the way, and in passing, the Russian military police, who played an important role in bringing large areas of Syria under control. Anyway, I have been told that the Russian military police is almost entirely staffed by Chechen fighters, many of whom I suspect are now being redeployed to this conflict area. Now, the Chechens have a reputation as being extremely tough and effective troops, and I can't imagine that they're simply being sent to Artyomovsk for defensive reasons. These are men who perhaps are most effective on the attack. The Chechens played a key role in the capture of Mariupol last year, and for all I know, that's what we're going to be seeing them do over the next couple of weeks. It does seem to me that, as I said, some kind of an attack further west from Artyomovsk, taking in Ivanivska and Khromovo, which, by the way, still remains under Ukrainian control, pushing further west, at least to Chasiv Yar. I would have said personally that that was on the cards. And last but not least, since I'm talking about Artyomovsk and I've referenced the Wagner organization, I should say that I've now had, well, they have now published a rundown of what they say is their achievements over the course of the war, since they were first deployed to the war zone in March of last year. And they claim to have destroyed around 300 tanks, hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, and importantly, to have either killed or severely wounded 72,000 Ukrainian soldiers. That's what they say. I have no way, again, of corroborating any of these claims that the Wagner organization make. They're not implausible, given, as I said, that yesterday Lieutenant Colonel Kiselyov of the Russian military. Well, I believe he's actually drawn from the Donbass militia, but he's now, technically speaking, a Russian military officer. And I believe, by the way, that he has a regular Russian military background. Anyway, Lieutenant Colonel Kiselyov was putting Ukrainian irretrievable losses, as he put it, in Bakhmut at 34 to 40,000. Prigozhin puts it higher at 50,000. So if that's correct, if these figures are true, well, maybe the 72,000 that Wagner is now claiming might not be so far off the actual number. It's important to remember that before they became committed to the fight in Bakhmut, the Wagner organization was involved in some very tough fights in other places, such as Popasnaya in Lugansk region, whose capture, by the way, last year proved enormously important in enabling the Russians to bring essentially the whole of Lugansk region under their control. So perhaps these figures are right, but I want to stress again, I can't corroborate them. I don't think it is possible to. So all of that going on the battlefronts, and lots of reports, by the way, of the Russians building up their forces, engaging in significant training up of reserves. The source I have, who's close to the Wagner organization, says that the Wagner troops who are being refitted and reinforced, and Prigozhin went out of his way to say, by the way, that that the Wagner forces have no lack of volunteers to join them. He put the number at 10,000 a month, which I'm sure, by the way, is an exaggeration, but never mind. Anyway, apparently they're being equipped with all kinds of weapons, re-equipped with all kinds of weapons, which would be more suitable perhaps for an offensive than for a defense. And with the BMPs that they're being supplied, perhaps they will play a role in a more dynamic battle than the one we have seen up to now. So lots of reports of that kind. So that's my brief summary of events on the battlefronts. A lot going on, no doubt. Some of it unknown to me. Fighting in and around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. Not always entirely clear exactly what's going on, but so far all the indications are that the Russians have the initiative in all places. Now, one area where they still clearly retain the initiative is in the war in the air, and yesterday saw a huge Geranium-2 kamikaze drone attack on Kiev. And according to the Ukrainians, 52 of these drones were used. The Ukrainians claim that they shot down 50 of them. Now, again, I have to say that may be true, but reports in The Guardian, which accepts that claim, reports that claim, reports in The Guardian also speak of destruction, of indications of destruction of many facilities and buildings in and around Kiev. So how is it possible to cause that much destruction if only 2 drones got through? Well, of course, one possible explanation is that Ukrainian air defense missiles are falling to earth and are crashing down, and that they're the cause of this destruction. And I would say for the record that I think that this Geranium-2 attack was principally intended to, in fact, deplete further Ukrainian air defenses in and around Kiev. I get the impression that with Ukraine having used up most of its stock of S-300 missiles and Buk missiles and unable to replace them, it doesn't manufacture these missiles itself, that it has concentrated what air defense assets it still has, including those supplied by the West, in and around Kiev itself. So it's logical, following the approach taken by General Surovikin, which he discussed in that interview, that one interview he gave back in October, about grinding the Ukrainians down, about conducting attrition. You can conduct attrition in terms of the ground war. You can also conduct attrition in terms of the war in the air. And these drone and missile strikes on Kiev seem to me to be primarily intended to do that. Now, there's been very little word as to which air defense systems Ukraine used in trying to defeat this drone attack over Kiev last night. And I did notice that there's been a commitment to supply urgently by the United States a NASAMS surface-to-air missile system to Ukraine. And I have to say that there is speculation in parts of the internet that this NASAMS system is intended to replace the Patriot system, which the Russians claim was largely destroyed in that Kinzhal missile strike about a week ago. That may be true, it may not be true. I can't say one way or the other. The United States and Ukraine officially claim that the Patriot system received only superficial damage and is in full operation. Who's to say? I think the Russian account is likely to be much more accurate. I suspect that the Russians have more information about all of this. But, you know, it may be that I'm wrong, and it may be that the NASAMS system has no relation to the Patriot at all. Anyway, there it is. That's speculation, as I said, that's appearing on the internet. You can read it as you wish. And it wasn't just Kiev that came under attack yesterday, though this was principally a drone attack, as far as I could see, right across Ukraine. But Uranium-2 drones were active even in parts of western Ukraine. And the major attack seems to have been on Kiev itself. But anyway, this drone attack also, as I said, was launched against these other places. Now, Ukraine is launching its own attacks on Russian facilities and Russian positions. There was another attempt by Ukraine, for example, to strike at a Russian oil facility in Krasnodar region, which is, by the way, located on the Black Sea, not far from Crimea, a little to the east of Crimea. It's a beautiful region. It used to encompass the city of Sochi, which is Russia's major resort area on the Black Sea, alongside Crimea, of course. Sochi, by the way, was separated from Krasnodar some years ago. Putting all that aside, that attack was repelled. And I have to say that all of these attacks that Ukraine has been launching, none of them seem to me to have much significance, to be particularly consequential. They're pinpricks. The United States says it disapproves of them. And nonetheless, they're getting a huge amount of coverage now in the Western media, which, for its part, tends to downplay the significance of the vastly greater Russian attacks on Ukrainian military infrastructure and military facilities and Ukrainian troops. And this, to me, is consistent with a very distorted coverage of the war that we're seeing in much of the media in the West. An overfocus on what Ukraine does, with an acceptance, an assumption that what Ukraine does is successful, and a disregard of what is very often the far greater quantity and quality of strikes carried out by Russia, which are on multiple orders of magnitude far more significant than anything that Ukraine can achieve. Now, I say all of that. There's been a very interesting article by my old friend Simon Tisdall in The Guardian, and there's a number of really rather extraordinary comments in it, in which he makes some reference to these Ukrainian actions. And he says, he makes a comment like this: Ukraine is increasingly setting the pace on the ground too, independently of its main backers. Incursions into southern Russia by anti-regime militia using US military vehicles, an audacious drone attack on the Kremlin, sabotage, assassinations and mystery explosions in occupied Crimea are a likely prelude to a pivotal counteroffensive. Note the tone of approval. Incursions into southern Russia by anti-regime militia. Can I reiterate again, that is a myth. The Ukrainians undoubtedly organised and carried out this attack, and if you believe the Russians, which on this point, by the way, I do, the great majority of the troops involved in that attack, well, the Russians say all of them were Ukrainian citizens, but with that aside, using US military vehicles, Simon Tisdall says that with apparent approval, an audacious drone attack on the Kremlin, sabotage, assassinations and mystery explosions in occupied Crimea. Assassinations. Simon Tisdall apparently approves of assassinations. Kiev's practice of assassinations within Russia. Assassinations which take in civilians, like Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, who is not a combatant, but apparently Simon Tisdall not only doesn't condemn that, he approves of it. He also, by the way, takes it for granted, takes it as read, that all of these audacious actions, as he describes them, are being carried out by Ukraine. I just thought I would mention this because, again, I read things every day in the Western media which seem to me to cross moral red lines that I would have thought once would never be crossed. And if we talk about The Guardian, once upon a time, I would have thought that absolutely inconceivable. Notice, by the way, that Simon Tisdall talks about anti-regime militia. Well, Ukraine has on occasion managed to cobble together some individuals of former Russian ethnicity or citizenship or nationality who it's put together in some of these units that it has sent across the border, though it doesn't seem to have been a significant part. There don't seem to have been any of them, or perhaps not many of them, in that recent attack in Belgorod. But anyway, notice that Simon Tisdall doesn't tell us anything about the extreme views of some of these people, who the Financial Times, for example, identified as white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Now, Tisdall presumably knows that, but he doesn't mention it. And of course, one wonders what the liberal readership of The Guardian would think if it knew about things like that. I'm going to come back to Simon Tisdale's article in a moment, because though this passage is extraordinary enough in itself, there is one which goes much further and which truly does take my breath away. But I'm going to come to that in a moment. Anyway, that, however, does lead me back to this topic of the offensive, Ukraine's great famous offensive. And Ukraine has now released videos of General Zaluzhny. He may not be very visible in terms of the public space, but apparently he is able to address his soldiers in a pre-prepared video. He's telling them that the time has come to take back what is ours. There's been pictures of Leopard 2 tanks. There's been interviews by Ukrainian officials. There was including one in The Guardian, by the way. All of which appear to convey the impression that this Ukrainian offensive that we've been hearing so much about for so many months is now about to happen. And the assumption seems to be that it's going to be sometime within the next 2 weeks, or even this coming week, perhaps before the end of May, at the start of June at the latest. Now, the Russians, for their part, tell us that they're not only ready, they're eager for this counteroffensive to happen. As I've discussed in previous programs, they not only expect this counteroffensive to be repelled, but some of the soldiers, and I've heard this now from, as I said, from this one particular source, but I think it's been sort of corroborated by other sources too. The Russians are looking forward not just to this counteroffensive because they know they will defeat it, but because they see it, the defeat of the counteroffensive, as offering them a springboard for an offensive of their own. And the latest person to talk in this way is Dmitry Rogozin, who for a certain amount of time was the Russian official in charge of the military-industrial complex, and he was also for a time a rather unsuccessful head of Roscosmos, the organization that manages Russia's space program. Now, I don't think Rogozin is somebody to take entirely seriously. I know many people in Russia don't. He is very much on the nationalist spectrum of Russian politics. He's a politician, I think, rather than a manager or an administrator, and he's certainly no sort of technocrat. He's had an interesting relationship with Putin in the past. Putin, however, seems to have lost interest in him. But anyway, Rogozin is still there. He still gives his interviews. He's still public. He says that he's been in contact with the troops. They're all telling him about how anxious they are to go on the attack. And Rogozin also says something perhaps which is also quite interesting. He says that because of the prolonged period of very wet weather during the spring, parts of the ground in Zaporozhye region remain waterlogged. That, in fact, even now, the ground has not fully dried out. Well, that's what he says. I'm not able to confirm this one way or the other. Perhaps we shouldn't pay too much attention, as I said, to what Rogozin says about conditions of the soil. But I think that the fact that he's someone else who comes out and says that there's growing mood of optimism amongst the troops, that they're keen to go on the attack, maybe we should start to take that a bit seriously. Anyway, we will see what the Russians do. But that now brings me to two other topics. Firstly, the F-16s. Bloomberg has another piece about the F-16s, and again, it's based on information provided by US personnel who are familiar with this aircraft. They say that they believe that the Russians have the capability to jam the systems of these aircraft. They say that the F-16s, at least the ones that Ukraine is likely to receive from the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, all of these countries, that its radar and its missiles are less potent than those of the Russian fighter jets that they would be up against. They say that if these F-16s are used in an offensive role to try, for example, to provide air support for this offensive, then they would be at serious risk, that if they approached the front lines, the Russians might easily shoot them down. I discussed that at length in my previous video. It's nice to see some experts confirming my theorizing on this issue. They said that they might be of some use to Ukraine in a strictly defensive role. But I have to say, I am skeptical even about that. What would F-16s possibly do if they were held back in the rear, trying to protect Kiev and, say, Western Ukraine from a Russian air offensive far from the front lines? The Russians don't attack Kiev and Western Ukraine with fighter jets, at least not at the moment, or bombers. They attack them with long-range missiles and drones and such things. And I doubt, frankly, that the F-16s, even with their AMRAAM missiles, would be much more effective in dealing with these missiles than Ukraine's existing air defense system is. So that, again, begs the question of what these F-16s are for. And, well, I'm not going to go over this again. I discussed this at huge length. It looks to me like a dangerous case of both tokenism and escalation. Ukraine has been demanding F-16s. The West has said, the United States has said, well, look, you'll get your F-16s, but you must launch this offensive too. And that, I think, is what the whole story is all about. But this is where I come back to Simon Tisdall, because Simon Tisdall, since pretty much the first day of the war, has been harping on his idea of the Western powers declaring no-fly zones over Ukraine. In other words, taking on the Russian Air Force and the Russian air defenses and the Russian military head on. And he has this extraordinary paragraph in this article. Biden and Sullivan rejected proposals by experienced former US generals for NATO-patrolled humanitarian no-fly zones, initially, note that word initially, in Western Ukraine to protect civilians from aerial assaults. Now, before I continue, can I just say that the consistent pattern of no-fly zones is that they quickly evolve when the West launches them into bombing campaigns. That was true in Iraq. That was certainly true, as I well remember, in Libya, when the UN Security Council resolutions, which the Russians very unwisely and to their lasting regret allowed to pass, authorized the imposition of no-fly zones, and the Western powers immediately used them as cover to launch a massive bombing campaign on the Libyan army, leading eventually to the collapse of Muammar al-Gaddafi's government. So when Tisdall talks about no-fly zones, I am sure that he has that in mind. And note again, use of that word initially. I mean, his plan is not just to take on the Russian air force, but ultimately to intervene in the war. I'm sure that's his thinking. Well, that's my reading of his words. And then he goes on to say this: although admittedly risky, safe havens akin to past operations in Iraq, Bosnia and Libya might have stemmed many lives and might have saved many lives and stemmed the refugee exodus. They still could. Notice those extraordinary words, although admittedly risky. So there are risks. What are these risks? Why doesn't Simon Tisdall tell us what these risks are, so that we can have an informed view, reach an informed view as to the options? Risks, first of all, to whom? To him, to the West, to the pilots, Western pilots flying these aircraft. Risks of a wider escalation. Risks of us all descending into an all-out war with the Russians. Risks of getting involved in World War III. What are these risks? He says that he appears to minimize the possibilities of escalation. He says that Putin knows that he can't win an all-out war against NATO, and that he's not a suicidal person, so he doesn't want to a nuclear exchange. But is that the only risk? Is that the risk that he means? What if he's wrong on both counts? What if the Russian government decides that this is too important for them and that they can't back off? After all, we've had reports in Bloomberg also that they have extremely advanced fighter jets with better radars and longer range and more powerful missiles than the F-16s have. Perhaps the Russians can take on the Western militaries. They have the world's most advanced air defense system, after all. Look at how we are hearing less and less about the Storm Shadow missiles. Now, there were reports in the West. The Daily Telegraph has been claiming that all of these fires that it sees as happening in areas in the rear of the Russian military are the product of Storm Shadow missiles. That's pure supposition. There's no claim to that effect by Ukraine. The Russians, by contrast, are now claiming again that they shot down more Storm Shadow missiles. They claim to have shot down 2 more just yesterday. They've also, by the way, claiming to shot down more Ukrainian fighter jets. I think the count is now running at least 2 Ukrainian jet aircraft, fighter jets or ground attack aircraft a day, which gives us again some idea of the level of losses, if true, and may explain why Ukraine is now so anxious to get hold of F-16 fighter jets. It's as much as anything else because before very long they won't have any fighter jets left, because the stock of Soviet-era fighter jets, both those they started the war with and those supplied by the East European states, will have finally and completely exhausted itself and run out. But anyway, put that aside. Maybe the risks are that we could find ourselves in a situation where US Western aircraft engaged in operating these no-fly zones are being shot down, shot out of the skies. Which point, let's assume that there is a crisis in the West. What do? Do we persist trying to impose these no-fly zones in the face of escalating losses? Do we back off and face utter humiliation? Or do we escalate? And escalate in what way? How are we going to escalate? Tisdall seems to assume that the choice on using nuclear weapons rests exclusively with Vladimir Putin. And I agree, he is a rational man. But if the imposition of a no-fly zone were to lead to heavy Western aircraft losses, and the choice came down to retreat or escalate, might it be that the West decides to escalate, in which case the possibilities of an uncontrolled nuclear exchange become very real? Anyway, I mean, I ask these questions because, of course, Tisdall doesn't provide us with an answer. He just talks about risks. He doesn't explain what those risks are. He talks about the Russians bluffing. Well, do the Russians bluff? One comes across this all the time. Self-evidently, and it's a point I think I would like to make because people consistently ignore it, the Russians don't bluff. The Russians said that Ukraine was a red line, that if moves were made to incorporate Ukraine into NATO, they would respond. They were concerned about the whole situation in Donbass, and well, we have a war. And no less a person than Henry Kissinger has come along and said that the decision to offer Ukraine NATO membership was a grave mistake and led us directly to that war. In other words, he in effect agrees with people like Jeffrey Sachs, even though I suspect Jeffrey Sachs and Henry Kissinger probably don't agree on many other things. But anyway, there we go. So the Russians don't bluff. There is no sign that the Russians are bluffing. People should not mistake Russian disciplined self-restraint in a very, very trying situation, one in which some people in the West have been repeatedly seeking to goad them into dangerous and unnecessary overreactions. People should not confuse that with the Russians bluffing. So, since the Russians don't bluff, what is the logic of Tisdall talking about bluffing? He says that Biden should listen to Tony Blinken. He's Secretary of State. He says that the Russians have given warnings of retaliation and direct confrontation. They rarely amount to much in practice. But he himself, Simon Tisdall, is advocating direct confrontation. He is saying that the Western powers should send their aircraft into a war zone and essentially drive the Russians out. Now, he's assuming that the Russians will pull back and won't respond. But as I've said already, the reality is that when we're talking about no-fly zones, they inevitably and invariably, based on past experience, evolve into bombing campaigns. This kind of commentary leaves me speechless. It's the sort of thing that once upon a time, during the Cold War, it would have been impossible to see in the Western media, at least in the British media, a person advocating this kind of direct military confrontation between the nuclear superpowers. And yet, it's now appearing in The Guardian. Simon Tisdall is, of course, The Guardian's foreign news editor. And this is what he advocates. And for all I know, it might eventually happen. I said at the beginning of the programme that despite the entirely legitimate complaint from people in the global south that the conflict in Ukraine is being given too much focus. Unavoidably, we are drawn back to it because of its inherent dangers. And this extraordinary article by Tisdall, who is far from alone in thinking in the way that he does, to my mind, illustrates why. There are some people in the West who are prepared to go all the way. The pattern that the United States has followed in this conflict, despite what Tisdall says, he talks all the time about the Biden administration having dithered, having been slow to act, having acted with hesitancy. Far from that being the truth. On the contrary, whenever Ukraine has been close to defeat, they've responded by escalating. And this has been incredibly dangerous. It is prolonging the war. It is causing more people to die. It is preventing or a negotiated settlement, which, as I've said before in previous programs, is clearly the purpose. And at the same time, it is heightening the risks. And a report from the Rand Corporation back in January said as much. It said that the United States should avoid getting drawn into a protracted war because the longer the war continued, the greater the risks became. And we see how. Now, about a year ago, I think, it was perhaps rather less than that, it was about 10 months ago, I made my first comment comparing the war in Ukraine with the one in Vietnam in the 1960s. And I spoke about how in Vietnam, the United States got trapped into a pattern of escalation. It found itself committed to supporting what was in effect a client regime, South Vietnam, not very different in many respects from the regime that we see in Kiev at the moment, and that meant that the United States first started with equipment and then advisors, and then those advisors gradually needed protection, so that meant that ground troops were quietly inserted, and then more ground troops were inserted, and then eventually the United States became involved in an all-out war in Vietnam, a war which it ultimately lost. It seems to me that the pattern is the same. That's what I said in my first video on this topic, making this comparison. It seems to me that the pattern is exactly the same over Ukraine, only the risks are much greater. We see the United States start with Javelin and Stinger missiles. It went on to M777 howitzers. It went on to HIMARS missiles, which supposedly it said it would never supply. Never taken that especially seriously, by the way. Then we've had tanks. They said they wouldn't supply their own tanks, Abrams tanks. It's only going to be European tanks, but they did eventually agree to supply Abrams tanks. And they're now in Germany, and we hear that Ukrainian troops are now going to be trained on them. We said they wouldn't supply infantry fighting vehicles. Well, they have. There's 100 Bradleys there. There's 100 Strykers there. Then they said there wouldn't be F-16s. Well, we see that they're preparing eventually at some point to supply F-16s. We've heard that there would be no Western troops on the ground, but we know that the British SAS is operating in Ukraine. There's been reports both in the US media and in the British media essentially confirming that. There are also other American troops on the ground in Ukraine. They are apparently there to try to find out what's happening to all these weapon systems that the West is delivering to Ukraine, lest they all get lost. And every day, every month, we've had more escalations. I forgot to mention the Patriot missile systems, which also the United States said it wouldn't supply, and which it did supply, and which the Russians claim have already been destroyed. And we see that people like Tisdall, for them, nothing is ever enough. They will always demand more. Ukraine itself will always demand more because Western leaders themselves, the Director of National Intelligence, Haskell, Boris Pretorius, the German Defense Minister, others have all said that without all this Western aid, Ukraine wouldn't survive for more than a few days. Josep Borrell said it too. So go on pumping more and more weapons into Ukraine, more and more advanced weapons into Ukraine. We're on the escalator, and there's no obvious sign of how we get off. And we have Tisdall, who wants us to go all the way up to the top, but he admits that there are risks, but he won't tell us what those risks are. Well, I have to say, I've never seen foreign policy before conducted in this way, certainly not in the nuclear age, and I wonder where this is going to end and how this is going to end. My hope still is that we will back off and we will see sense in the end prevail. I mean, all this talk of frozen conflicts and all of that looks as if some people in Washington do understand that this can only go so far before it becomes really dangerous. But if they do back off, if we do end up with that kind of frozen conflict, then be very aware that many people, not just Tisdall, won't be pleased. Anyway, let me move on and now come to this issue of the debt ceiling. I've never taken this issue seriously. I don't understand why people do. It comes up every couple of years. I think the last time was in 2011. No other country has a debt ceiling. To my mind, people have got this one all completely wrong. If there had not been an agreement to extend funding, government's funding beyond the debt ceiling, well, I don't think the United States would have defaulted. I don't think there would have been a collapse of the US economy. I don't think any of these dramatic things would have happened. The United States, for the present, is not going to run out of money. It may do so eventually, but not because the debt ceiling limits are exceeded. There's always a way to find money in the United States. The Pentagon has just done that, or at least the administration has, in terms of funding the supply of weaponry to Ukraine. They've just revalued some of the weaponry they did supply, lowered the value by $3 billion, and that's given them $3 billion more that they can use, or so they pretend, to ship more weapons to Ukraine. We can always come up with these sort of tricks. The Federal Reserve Board could always create more money. The government could move money around within its coffers. All kinds of things could be done. There's no reason to think that this would have been a crisis. And besides, no one in the political system, not the president, not the Republicans in Congress, none of them really believes that there would be a financial crisis if the debt ceiling was breached. If they really did think that, they wouldn't go through the charade of engaging in this confrontation, this pretense that this issue really mattered. They wouldn't want to risk the US economy or the US government's funding by posturing in this kind of way. What they have agreed, and it suits the administration and the Republicans to do that, is a real cut in US government spending over the next year. Now, I say that because, as I understand it, spending is going to be limited over the next year to what it was last year, which, given that we have annualized inflation of around 5% in the United States at the moment, is a real cut. And of course, defense spending is going to be increased by 3.3%, which the Biden administration insisted upon. That too is a cut, though a smaller one, assuming, of course, inflation remains at 5%. But the US government will tick along. The president will be able to say that he would have had a much more ambitious spending program, but he's been prevented from doing that by the Republican diehards in Congress. So as he goes into re-election, he can blame the Republicans for any problems caused by the fact that the government isn't able to spend as much as it wants to, because, as I said, there's been an actual real cut in spending once you take inflation numbers into account. So that way he can motivate and energize his supporters, whilst the Republicans, for their part, can come forward and say, well, they held the president to an actual cut in spending. They are the people who care about the budget. They are concerned to bring the budget under control. So if you vote for them, you can be sure that you're supporting the party of sound money. This is all theatre. It has no reality. It doesn't remotely address the actual problems of the United States. It could be, I believe it will be the case, that one day the United States will face a severe financial reckoning. But be absolutely sure that when that happens, it won't be because of anything to do with the debt ceiling. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. We'll see when this Ukrainian offensive happens. We'll see what the Russians decide to do in the Bakhmut, Artyomovsk area, whether there will be an offensive there. We'll see what happens elsewhere in the world as well. Specifically, we will see what happens in the Turkish elections. But as I said, that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. And can I, in the meantime, remind you that you can find all our programs on our various channels, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop and get yourself the excellent things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick your subscription to this channel. Thank you. And to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon.